Danny Hodge passed away, I guess hours before. It was like the news was bam, bam. Which, obviously, he was, 88, I think? Well, yes, 88. So that wasn't shocking or unexpected, although I think a lot of people looked at Hodge as one of those guys like Luthez. It's just like, no, he doesn't die. What do you, Flair? No, that's not possible. Die, Hodge. But I mean, in this case, I guess they did report that Hodge had problems with dementia for the last few years, which when you're 88, I guess is understandable, and have been of combat sports for that much of your life. But when I'm afraid this is going to get, looked over and covered up a little bit, or people not delve into Danny Hodge, is because he's another one of these wild bull curries. It's got to this point, he's before the video era of VCRs at least, and he didn't work a lot of the major territories that had the nationally syndicated programs, so there's a lot of video left out there. So I'm afraid that he's going to get overlooked like some of these guys from that generation, and people aren't going to understand exactly what kind of impact he had on this business and on wrestling in general, amateur and professional. I mean, we're starting, as you said, it's usually a legend, but none of the guys were in the ring with him. Well, there's very few people, Jim Ross, and very few people left in the business that actually worked with Hodge. Les Thatcher, that worked with him in the ring or worked with him as JR did, refereeing and announcing, or just knew him, were in the locker room with him, etc. And this guy, a movie should be made. We talked about the wrestler movie question. We want to see Bruno. We want to see Buddy Rogers. How could they not have already tried to pitch a movie about Danny Hodge as an American hero? I wonder if that ever was even a thing, or if anybody ever noticed. What do you think?
I think, I've been reading a lot about him the last few days. I read a good column that Greg Oliver put up on Slam Wrestling, and I didn't even know that much about his early days, growing up in the Dust Bowl.
Oh, my God.
But you read about that. You read about his wrestling career, his amateur wrestling career, his pro wrestling career, the accident and holding his neck in place. It's an amazing life.
Well, here's the thing. Jim Ross, in his books and the stories that he's talked about when he was a kid in Oklahoma. He grew up poor, and his heroes were Mickey Mantle and Danny Hodge, two great Oklahomans, right? Imagine Hodge 20 years earlier in the 30s, during the Depression, in the Dust Bowl. It's like a Stu Hart thing. You can draw some comparisons. Stu Hart 20 years earlier in the 19-teens, grew up with his family. They lived in a tent in the fucking Alberta winters for 2 or 3 years. He had nothing. They ate dirt, right? One of those type of things. And even though they had their side where you could see them as fatherly, figures and, gentlemen and etc., they had some shit. The deprivation or the depression or the poverty or whatever, to them, it wasn't cruelty. It was just, there was something about Hodge and Stu and guys like that. And I guess that upbringing or whatever. But when you think about it, Danny Hodge was a bigger, I won't say star because he wasn't necessarily a star. He was a bigger name in the United States of America than almost any professional wrestler when Hodge turned pro. He was already a bigger name because he'd been to the Olympics. He'd been on the cover of Sports Illustrated. The high points of his amateur career, I jotted a couple things down. Because, I mean, JR loved him, and we used to talk about this, and I've done some background when he would make some of those appearances. JR had him doing in the late 90s. I think he was one of the judges at the Brawl for All. I gave the guys in production notes on Hodge. But
was he there at the riot that Shawn Michaels caused?
Yes, because Little Rock, Arkansas was one of the old McGurk towns. They brought him in as a special attraction. I think he was going to referee or be at ringside or do something. And he was there and he was another one of those guys, like if Michaels thinks this is a fucking hot crowd, He should have been here in fucking 62 when I fucking worked with Savoldi, right? Or whatever. But he was a high school state wrestling champion in Oklahoma in his weight class. Then he went to college late because he enlisted in the Navy, and he wrestled in the Navy. And then when he went to Oklahoma as a collegiate wrestler at the University of Oklahoma, one of the top colleges in the country for wrestling programs, he went 46-0. 36 of his wins were by pin, but that's never mind that. As a collegiate wrestler at the University of Oklahoma, going all the way to the NCAA championship, the same title that Brock won, that Kurt won, that fucking Briscoe won, he was never taken down as a college wrestler. Danny Hodge never left his feet involuntarily as a collegiate wrestler at Oklahoma. That's unheard of. He would go down voluntarily to take you with him, right? He was a 3-time Big 7 champion. He was a 3-time NCAA champion at 177 pounds, 3 years in a row, 1955, 56, and 57. He won all 3 final matches, won the title by pin. The only other person to do that in NCAA history was Earl McCready in like 1920, who also turned pro. And the only reason I believe, I can't remember the specifics, I didn't have time to flip through the book, but he was a 3-time NCAA champion because he wasn't eligible one of his years at Oklahoma. I don't know if his freshmen were ineligible then or because of his age, because he'd been in the Navy, whatever, but that was 3 years in a row. In the 1956 Olympics, he was the silver medalist, and you'll remember, as we recall, this was the subject. I think they did did they do a 30 for 30, or was it just a regular documentary? I've seen a piece on it, but Hodge lost the gold medal in the finals to the Bulgarian when he pinned himself. Hodge pinned him. He snatched the guy and did the suplex or whatever the fuck he was doing to the guy. And when he went through with it, his own shoulders touched the mat. And the referee, who I think was from one of the countries sympathetic to Bulgaria, called the fall. So Hodge is the only guy in history, I think, of the Olympics that beat himself in the gold medal match. And that's the year he made the cover of Sports Illustrated. Then after he got out of college, he took up amateur boxing, having never put on a pair of gloves in his life. And he won the 1958 Chicago Golden Gloves. He went 17-0 as an amateur with 12 knockouts. And then he skipped the 1960 Olympics so that he could turn pro as a boxer, and went 8-2. And then I heard him tell this story in person. He said, I was making shit for money and I didn't trust these people. And I went home to Oklahoma, and he quit professional boxing. And that's when Leroy McGurk got a hold of him. And how could this have been more tailor-made? Leroy McGurk is not only a fucking ex-wrestler and junior heavyweight and loved the shooters and promoted Oklahoma, and the guy that Sports Illustrated is calling the greatest wrestler in the world is from Oklahoma and lives down the street. And they immediately snatched him and trained him. And I think I can't remember what his initial contract was, but I believe Hornbaker said that by 1962, Hodge was making $80,000 a year based out of Oklahoma, but defending the NWA World Junior Heavyweight Championship. So that would be somewhere in the neighborhood of 300 and something grand today, would it not? But the legitimacy, that's why Oklahoma, the fans in Oak City and Tulsa, we've talked about the riots and people trying to hit the ring. And in other parts of the country, yes, you had especially some promoters, like the Gaga and, or the workers or whatever. But generations of people in the state of Oklahoma grew up, if they watched pro wrestling or they heard about pro wrestling, the guy that Sports Illustrated said was the greatest wrestler in the world is their fucking champion. So they believed more than your average bear that there was something to fucking wrestling. Well, remember the story about Hodge's father and Savoldi? When they broke him in, Hodge didn't smarten up his father that wrestling was a work. And they're in either Tulsa or Oak City, wherever. I think it was a gimmick boxing match. But Angelo Savoldi was the guy that Hodge was about to beat for the World Junior Heavyweight title. And they're having a gimmick boxing match because of Hodge's background as a boxer. And Savoldi starts heeling on him and does something, has him in the ropes doing whatever. Hodge's father got hot, pulled out a fucking knife, jumped up ringside and fucking slashed. People say he stabbed him. He didn't stab him. He wasn't trying to kill him, go for the heart. He fucking, get off my son. He slashed him with the fucking thing. Took like 70 stitches. And that's when they told Hodge, smarten your fucking father up. But guys took the business seriously in those days, right? So unless he got the okay, he wasn't going to tell his dad what was going on. But anyway, that's the kind of thing is Hodge was already a major celebrity. He was like Kurt Angle, except he was following up quicker. Kurt, took a few years there where he was out of the spotlight after the Olympics before he finally took the plunge. But Hodge jumped right in, so he was a huge fucking name. And he had gotten mainstream newspaper and television news coverage, so he was worth their investment. And he built pretty much Oklahoma and the McGurk territory and what would become Mid-South Wrestling later when Watts got involved and later on after Hodge's accident. He built and kept that whole territory running, even when we were there in '84. And it had been almost 10 years since he'd been retired. You'd talk to fans and they're like, well, Hodge could have fucking whipped him, or whatever. It was just So we've talked about Hulk Hogan and Bruce Lee, right? Everybody always wants to know who was tougher than who and who could whip who. The comparisons are always going to be there. And everybody who has been in the business for a while picks Hodge over everybody. And a lot of people are going to call bullshit. Hodge and Brock Lesnar, right? Okay. Well, obviously, with both same age, I think Brock could have got Danny when he was 75 and Brock was fucking whatever. But a lot of people would look at Hodge and go, well, even in his prime, he started balding early and he wasn't that big of a guy. Brock would have an advantage, obviously, size-wise, but when you go back and look at the legitimate, and this is probably something that the amateur wrestling buffs ought to break down. But when you say if it went strictly to technique, Hodge was faster, Hodge was better wrestler, Brock used the power and his size, etc. But if Brock could smother him, yeah, there may have been a chance, but more likely, Hodge could have got him in something before Brock knew what the fuck was going on and the fucking grip.
That's what it was. He would have had him with the handshake at the beginning of the match.
If Brock had shook hands with him first, that would have been it. And everybody knows what we're talking about, I hope, but we will mention Hodge. You talk about guys being freaks of nature. Hodge was a freak of nature. He had double tendons. He was born. I don't think you can surgically do this, right? He was born with double tendons in his fucking hands, arms, whatever the fuck. And the grip was the thing. He started doing the apple, crushing the apple. And then in wrestling, everybody that did the claw, the Germans, and everybody wanted to do the same thing and crush the apple. Well, they couldn't for real because Hodge was doing it for real, right? I smartened the Von Erich boys up to this in MLW last year. We were going to do it. You boil the apple if you want to work it. You boil it a certain amount so it softens up, but it still has its shape. And then they were going to do it, but we didn't have a kitchen. They were going to try to microwave it in the fucking hotel lobby, but it didn't have the technology kills all the wrestling gimmicks. But Hodge would crush the apples for real. Not only that, they would take him on publicity, PR tours. When he'd go into the towns, JR has been with him on some of these. He would be, he'd go to the local hardware store and they'd take pictures of him. He would pick up pliers off the display rack and squeeze and snap the pliers. And it wouldn't be a gimmick. And then he would get mad sometimes, or if he just wanted to fuck with guys, like if he wanted to fuck with you, or if he wanted to fuck with the building or whatever. They said after he'd leave the shower, you'd go in and he would have just taken and turned the shower nozzles so far that he broke them off so nobody else could take a fucking shower. I've been grabbed in a working way or fucking around in the locker room or whatever by the Road Warriors and the Steiner brothers and Mark Henry. But the only thing I can equate Hodge's handshake to is Thesz's, except Hodge had the grip. He would do it. I'll explain in a second. But Thesz's hands, his fingers and his knuckles, and even the palms of his hands had been broken so many times that he had calcium deposits everywhere. And it was like, if you shake hands with Mark Henry or Barbarian, or they squeeze you, it's like a catcher's mitt squeezing you until it hurts. But when you shook hands with Thez or Hodge, it was all hard and bone. So it didn't even take much pressure, but there was no padding, right? But when you would go up to Hodge, because I'd first seen him in Louisville when I was a kid, because he toured through Tennessee for a little while in early 75. And I'm only 13 years old, and I didn't know the backstory. I'd only discovered the wrestling magazines a couple years before that, right? And I'd seen Danny Hodge, World Junior Heavyweight Champion, but I didn't know about the legendary Shooter. And he was a heel here, so he was doing the black glove and the claw, and he was crushing the apples. But I actually saw him, Brian, you'll love his tag team partner. They teamed up for about a month here in this territory on an underneath match. I can't even remember who it was. I should get my Louisville book out, but two fucking baby faces against Danny Hodge and Professor Dale Lewis.
Oh, wow.
And Dale Lewis was the 1965 NCAA heavyweight champion, I think a year or two after Jack Briscoe. So you can imagine in the locker room, it meant more. See, here, the history wasn't followed up on because they weren't going to push these guys for a long period of time. So they didn't flesh out Danny Hodge and Dale Lewis. They were passing through. But you can imagine in the locker room when you walk in and, yeah, you're working tonight with Danny Hodge and Dale Lewis. Fuck.
Ron Fuller tells his story that when he had both of them working for him in the early days of Southeastern, he was doing the thing with Dale Lewis where if any fan could get in the ring and beat him, they would get $1,000 or whatever. And it's Dale Lewis, no one's going to beat him. And then one night, Hodge like stormed the ring. It was just like, hurt him, beat him, you gotta do it. And Dale Lewis ended up hurting the guy, and the guy sued, and both guys left the territory right away. That was the end of Professor Dale Lewis and Danny Hodge in Southeastern.
Those shoot challenges, see, Ron did more than they did on this end of Tennessee to flesh the guys' amateur backgrounds out and everything. But those shoot challenges, as Tim Woods will tell you, never turn out well, even when the guy loses. But yeah, anyway, I didn't appreciate it then, but then the first time I actually met him in person was in 1979. He came to the WFIA Fans Convention in Memphis. And the Gilberts, Tommy and Eddie Gilbert, were huge fans of his. And he came and just did a little display. And I mean, it wasn't far from, Oklahoma to Memphis. He drove up and spent the weekend with everybody. And even then, it's only been 3 years since his accident. He had that meek voice. He just, you would have made fun of his voice. Somebody in the locker room would have made fun of his voice if it wasn't Danny Hodge, but nobody did. But he sounded like a fucking CPA from Perry, Oklahoma, and he looked fatherly, and he was starting to kind of be a little bit gray around the temples even then. But so when he shook hands with you, he would give you enough to where you could kind of experience what it was like, but he wouldn't hurt anybody. And then he'd give you a little more if it was one of the boys and he wanted to mess with you, or like a thing to do when he was at these fan fests or the Cauliflower Alley Club or whatever, was you catch somebody in his vicinity that you want to fuck with, right? And then you grab that person and you tell, hey, Danny, Brian last year says your grip ain't shit, right? It's all a big, and he'd get the big eyes and the smile would come. And then, of course, whoever you've, corralled over there would be shitting, no. And he'd take your hand and he'd give it to you just enough. Oh, okay, yeah, I'm sorry. And then one time they did it to me. Somebody did it to me, and he reached around and he just got like with his thumb and middle finger around my biceps from behind, and just with that, I could still see his pinkies and everything sticking out. It was just, oh God, please no. Just a second. But it was fucking, It was very, very, you wouldn't want him mad at you. And there's another thing. Somebody mentioned, well, what about him and Angle? Similar size. Brock wouldn't have the big size advantage that Brock would have. I'm sure Kurt's technique was great, and he was an Olympic gold medalist and did win it with a broken freaking neck. But there's no way in the world that I've known Kurt that I don't think that Kurt could, at the same time as Danny Hodge was so fatherly, I don't think that Kurt could ever do the horrible things to the human body that Danny Hodge would do to you. It's one of those Stu Hart things. And you never heard about Hodge and Thez working out. I've never heard a story about that. I think and even though Thez was almost 20 years older, 15 years older or whatever, he was still very active and they worked. But I think, Thez, it's another one of those things. If it was completely strict collegiate or Olympic wrestling rules, Hodge would have stretched him. Thez's hope would have been that he could get on one of the holes that was banned in any competition that he learned from Strangler Lewis, and then that would have worked. But if Hodge knew any of those, holy shit. But have you ever heard of any Hodge and Thez stories? Or did they just respectfully sit on opposite sides of the locker room and smile at each other?
I just actually posted, because I was going through the Wrestling News archives for Danny Hodge stuff after I heard that he passed, and I did find, I'm trying to pull it up right now, a newspaper article from, this is January 29th, 1964, in El Paso, dream match, Lou Thesz, World Heavyweight Champion versus Danny Hodge.
Yes.
World's Junior Heavyweight Champion.
They worked a number of times, and Hodge, I've got check out some mid '60s Florida, because Eddie Graham loved the shooters. Because if his wrestlers could wrestle at a high level, then when his gimmick guys did bloody shit, it stood out even more, right? So he liked that, and at one time in the '60s, Hodge, Thez, and Carl Gotch were all working the fucking territory in Florida,
and that's where he met Matsuda, right?
Yeah, well, as a matter of okay, the story. So Hiro Matsuda, who would be a World Junior Heavyweight Champion, and he was a protege of Inoki's until he came to this country, right? And he fancied, and he was the guy that broke Hulk Hogan's leg when Hogan wanted to train to get in the bear, broke his ankle, trained to get in the business. Matsuda, apparently this story is true. I've heard it several different places. Matsuda paid Carl Gotch $10,000 to train him for a gym match with Danny Hodge. And then they had the match. And this was not, that's why I said with Thez and Hodge worked, but I never heard of any competition. But Matsuda pays Gotch $10,000 to train him for a match in a gym, just to see legitimately, who's best with Danny Hodge. And they had the match, and Matsuda, after about a minute, what'd he say? Well, I just wasted $10,000.
I wrote a letter to the Observer in the late 90s when UFC started getting popular, saying who would win in a match, Danny Hodge versus Carl Gotch. And even Dave couldn't really answer. He's like, well, that's a really tough one to say.
Well, and the thing, I know that since the 90s, I don't know if they do it in UFC circles, but they do it in wrestling circles, and they probably do it in amateur wrestling circles, because the Hodge Trophy, which is like the Heisman Trophy of wrestling, is named for Danny Hodge. So amateur wrestling, he's still a big name in that world. And but every supposition of what if Danny Hodge had been in the UFC, if UFC was around when Danny Hodge or Danny in his prime was here now or whatever, it ends with him running the fucking place in whatever weight class he was in, or several. One of the great quotes, I saw one of the articles because this was news in the newspapers and on TV in Oklahoma this past week. Is one of their most decorated amateur athletes in history of the state in any sport. One amateur wrestler's quote about wrestling Hodge was, "For the first 2 periods, I thought I was going to die. And in the third period, I was afraid I wouldn't." It's like, what the fuck? Everybody, you'll never know. You can't do the time machine and you can't do the what if, but everybody that's had experience with this guy or is knowledgeable in these fields, says hands down, there's asterisks for if he was outweighed by 100 pounds or if he was such and such, years older or whatever. But he was the most dominant combat sport athlete in the United States of all time. And we talked about Dan Severn being one of the most decorated amateur athletes ever in the United States. Dan, I think, would probably say Hodge was the man. And because he was just so dominant in his field, you can't just tell me that for 3 years, there wasn't any good wrestlers around and he just breezed through the Olympics. No, he was more dominant than any of these other guys were at their points in history.
I mentioned at the top, we should probably let people know who don't know the story, his car accident. Coming back from what? Houma, Louisiana.
Which, boy, then that just makes it even worse. Because you come back from a big show, a major coliseum, a main match, a big payoff or whatever, fucking Houma, the fucking toilet of Louisiana. But yes, he was going back to Oklahoma. And those days we've talked about, and this was 1976. This was even before that. There was no north and south interstates in those states down there in Louisiana and Arkansas. And he's on one of those state highways in the middle of the night and either goes to sleep or whatever. He's traveling by himself and runs off into the bayou, runs off the road into one of those. It's more like a swamp than it is a body of water that they've got on the sides of a lot of those roads down there. And boom, and breaks his neck, and he comes to consciousness, and he's underwater in the car, off the road, realizes his neck is broken, and with one arm, he holds his neck in place, kicks the fucking door or the window or whatever, gets out of the car, gets out of the water, and walks 2 or 3 miles to the nearest, they don't have farmhouse, bayou house or whatever, there's somebody to call an ambulance for him while he's holding his broken fucking neck. Him and Angle. At least Danny didn't have to compete with it. But that's what ended his career. After that, he was, he couldn't take a chance on wrestling again. But still, I mean, he's coached since then. He's still a huge figure or still, was over the past number of years until at least recently in amateur wrestling in Oklahoma and went to a lot of the meets. He's the only wrestler in history to have his picture on the cover of his hometown phone book, Perry, Oklahoma. I have a copy of that phone book cover autographed personally to me on my wall in the vault. And of course it's an inset picture of him in his Olympic days, and then a picture of him as the, grandfatherly Danny Hodge, all dressed up and everything. And it's Perry, Oklahoma, home of Danny Hodge. So, and at the same time as he was, a badass and could do all this shit, and like I said, had that Stu Hart kind of cruelty streak where he didn't mind doing these things but didn't feel like it was cruel. There was also an article on one of the online news reports from one of the Oklahoma papers that talked about this guy whose son was an amateur wrestler, and they happened to be standing in line at a fast food place, and the guy said, "Oh, go up and shake Danny Hodge's hand. That's him right there." And the kid did, and Hodge gets down on the floor with him, talks to him, gives him a pep talk. Ignores his own family that he's there with, and not only peps the kid about wrestling but school and being good and all this other stuff, and then wrestles around on the floor with him and shows him a couple of things. He just you would have imagined you were meeting your grandfatherly neighbor if you didn't know that this was the fucking baddest man on the planet, the American version of Bruce fucking Lee. But maybe the Dust Bowl built character, Brian.
Maybe.
I don't know if I want to go back and experience it to find out.
It's amazing how many great wrestlers came out of Oklahoma. I mean, when you talk about Danny Hodge, in terms of pro and amateur, Jack Briscoe, obviously, Jerry Briscoe, Watts. Watts was an amateur wrestler too.
Dr. Death. Well, and going back to Earl McCready, as I mentioned before, which came first, the chicken or the egg? Did Oklahoma have a great wrestling program and that's why it spawned great wrestlers? Or did Oklahoma have great wrestlers and that's why it had a great wrestling program? There's something about the Midwestern states. Nebraska wasn't too shabby either. The Midwestern states bred hardier hand-to-hand combat athletes. It seems the farm work out there in the plains. I don't know what it is, but you don't find too many fucking great pro wrestlers or great amateur wrestlers rather from the suburbs of Los Angeles.